So, Joseph, I'm so thrilled to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Danielle. Looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah. Now, Joseph, you wear a lot of different hats as a speaker, as a podcaster, but you also have another role in your life as a career consultant. So, tell me, what does a typical day look like for you?
Well, every day is a little different for me, Danielle, and I really enjoy that about my current work. So you're right, I am a career consultant, and my work primarily falls into three areas. So, first of all, where I spend most of my time is I'm a speaker, workshop, and webinar host. So, I host workshops and webinars for primarily business schools, but also corporate clients. And I talk primarily about career change and personal branding topics. I am also a writer, kind of an informal writer. So I do some contributing writing to publications, including in the past Forbes and Fast Company. And along those lines, I group advisory in with that category where I'm sharing advice with people either one on one with my private clients in one on one consulting sessions, or more broadly where I share my advice through blog posts or the writing I do elsewhere. And then the third area is that I'm a podcast host myself. So I host a podcast called Career Relaunch, and that actually takes up a good chunk of my time. So an average day for me, it kind of depends on the week. So today, for example, I've just released a new episode on my podcast. So today's going to be all about sharing the podcast and reconnecting with the guest who was on my show. And so today's very much a podcasting day. But yesterday was very much a presentation prep day because I've got a presentation next week. So I might be working on the presentations. So it just kind of depends. I also have a virtual team. So I really enjoy working with them. They're kind of spread around the world. So, yeah, every day is a little bit different for me.
Excellent. Now, Joseph, you've actually got a fascinating story, and I've obviously been doing a lot of research and kind of stalking you, for use of a better word.
It's okay. I
And
do the same with people.
look, there's been a lot of like twists and turns and in your own career. And I just feel like there's this really rich tapestry of experience. So, how did you get to where you are today? Like, and I've got to say, like, starting out as I think it was Joe's floppy disks, selling blank
Oh,
floppy
yeah. Oh,
disks
you
as a
did do your
15-year-old.
research on me.
I've really gone back through the archives. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time to do that. Do you want me to go back to like childhood?
Oh no, this isn't a psychology
I
session.
can.
But like, how did you get into the career consultancy? Like, what? There's been a number
Yeah.
of, I suppose, experiences that's led to that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I'll give you the maybe time lapse version of this, and then we can go into more detail as you want to and as you find interesting. But since you mentioned Joe's discs, that was well, it was when I was in high school, and I'd actually planned for really most of my childhood and my early years to become a doctor. But when I was around the age of it was like 16 or 17, I started a little business in the basement of my parents' home, and it was called Joe's Discs. And I basically bought floppy disks in bulk and then resold them to people. And I would advertise on what was kind of the predecessor to the internet as we know it today, which was called bulletin board systems. And it was this really like almost kind of archaic now, but at the time, really kind of revolutionary way for people to connect with one another. And I loved the enterprising aspect of that, but I didn't really pursue it because I was focused on getting into medical school. I went to Northwestern University, studied psychology, focused on pre medical sciences, and then ended up applying to and getting into medical school. Went to Georgetown School of Medicine, realized it wasn't a good fit for me, and I dropped out after 2 weeks of being in the program. Spent the next few years working in the business world, and that's where I started the next chapter of my career focused on primarily brand marketing. So I spent 3 years working in DC, Washington, DC, working in corporate brand marketing. Did my MBA at the University of Michigan. Spent the next 4 years marketing things like bin liners and drain opener for brands, including Glad, which I know is sold in Australia, and Liquid Plumber. Then moved to the UK and marketed luxury desserts, including for Goo and also Haagen Dazs. And so I'd spent this time working in the marketing world, but then found myself really wanting to do something different and tapping into more of my personal experiences of navigating career change myself, not only leaving medical school, but also moving geographies. And so I decided to leave the corporate world behind and start my own career consultancy focused on helping people relaunch their careers. And I think it was sort of a tie in to those early days where I liked the idea of starting my own business and doing my own thing. And so that's kind of the snapshot of how it all happened.
Well, you've certainly done that. And so, was there a trigger or something that really created that shift from building and relaunching products to help build and relaunch people?
Yeah, it was probably a slow process that I felt along the way. I feel like I actually really enjoyed the world of marketing. I found trying to get people to think more about trash bags to be a very interesting endeavor and trying to drive demand for products that people don't generally think about very much. So I like the idea of marketing. I found the industry of marketing really interesting and branding and creating an image for an otherwise commoditized product. And I did enjoy that, but I think that the trigger point for me was, well, a few things. Number one was just maybe just not feeling maybe comfortable marketing the products I was marketing. So the most recent product I marketed was ice cream, and I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with luxury ice cream. I don't think it quite classifies as junk food, but it's not good for you. And I kind of pride myself on being somebody who at least attempts to be healthy. And as somebody who was interested in the medical sciences for a long time, it was really hard to reconcile that. Like making a living off of trying to get people to eat more ice cream felt a little strange to me. I had also moved on to a global team where I felt like I wasn't doing as much marketing. It was much more about stakeholder management and internal alignment building. And I wasn't as interested in that side of the inevitable part of the corporate world that you have to navigate. The biggest one for me was my father actually passed away in 2012, which was the same year I got married and the year after I joined Haagen Dazs. And that was what really got me thinking and kind of reminding me of the fragility of life and how important it is to do work that you feel proud of and that you feel is aligned to who you are as an individual. And that's what ultimately propelled me to leave the corporate world behind and try to focus more on what I felt was more in line with my own values.
Yeah, great. And look, for our listeners as well, Joseph's got this amazing TEDx talk that talks about a lot of the transitions and those decisions that you made along the way, like leaving medical school and things like that. And for some, like you did a lot of research, a lot of study before getting into medical school. So to then make that call, it was a
Yeah.
really brave move.
It was definitely not, I guess it wasn't really part of my DNA at the time to quit things. It's funny because I was just talking with my wife, Danielle, the other day about I used to play the violin when I was very young. And I was telling her, because we're thinking about which activities to get our daughter involved with. And she's 4, she's just over 4 years, she's 4.5 years old right now. And she asked me, did you like playing the violin? I said, not really. Not, I played for about 12 years. And I said, it wasn't until about the 11th year that I started to enjoy it. And she said, well, did you ever think about quitting? And I said, not really. I just didn't, it never really even entered my mind that you could quit any activity. Like it was just not, it wasn't part of my vernacular. It wasn't part of my worldview that you could quit anything. And then you're right, Danielle. So in the United States, you invest at least 4 years in undergraduate studies, studying the medical sciences. You then have to take a 10-hour exam. You then have to apply to get into medical school. The acceptance rate is anywhere between like 1 to 3%, and so you're jumping through a lot of hoops to get there. And yeah, I think this is one of the hardest things when you're walking away from your originally planned career path is you've invested so much into it, and it's hard to walk away from that investment. It's not intuitive, it's not logical, and yeah, it was a tough moment in my life.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm really conscious of some of our listeners would be thinking, hang on a minute, isn't this podcast about meant to be about podcasting? And what I really love, and to pick up on that point, is like I see podcasters often fall into three really unique camps. And one is a regular podcast. I love it, can't get enough of it, which is great. Then we get the second camp that says, I'm passionate about it, but I feel like it's a little bit self indulgent and that it's taken me away from my, in inverted commas, real work. And then the third group who says, I'm not enjoying it, but I don't want to quit. I need to see this through. So, my question for you is like, how do we tune into those inner voices or their gut feel, that gut feel, and know which ones to actually lean into and which to actually silence and keep pushing on?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Daniel. I hadn't really thought about those categories until you mentioned it. But you're right. I think that we as podcasters probably, yeah, you're right. They kind of fall into one of those three categories at any given time, and maybe they overlap a little bit. But I can tell you, I've probably I probably fluctuated through each of those three stages before. So like when I started my podcast, I was super passionate about it, loved it, was pumping out an episode every other week. And then I went through a period where I felt like, okay, this is kind of a side project. It's not really necessarily earning me any like income. I don't see the real tangible material benefits of it on a day-to-day basis. So maybe I should just stop doing it. And then I got to a point where I was doing it maybe a couple years ago, and I wasn't enjoying it as much, but I kept doing it anyway. And then I've been through all those stages, and I suppose I've now restarted the podcast, and I do it on a monthly basis, and I really enjoy doing it. I suppose it's worth thinking about a couple things. Number one, what is the opportunity cost of doing the podcast? So I think with anything you're doing, you could be doing something else. And so the question is, okay, if you stop doing your podcast, let's say you fall into that third category that you mentioned, you don't like doing the podcast anymore. Maybe you kind of hate it, feels like it's a bit of a slog, a bit of a drag, but you don't want to quit because you've come this far with it. I guess the question is, well, what would you be doing instead? And would that other thing bring you something important into your work or your life that you're just not getting from podcasting? So that's one thing to think about. I suppose the next thing to think about is what do you feel your podcast is doing for your listeners? And how important is it for you to feel like you're continuing to serve that need? And so I think thinking a little bit about yourself, but also the people you're serving is important. And for me, um, thinking about how I was serving my listeners is ultimately what got me to restart my podcast. Again, it was kind of mid-pandemic, but it's a hard decision to make. It's a lot of work to do a podcast, as I'm sure you know.
Absolutely. So let's look at your podcast, which is called Career Relaunch, which I must add is in the top 20 career podcasts in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Singapore. And you've got listeners across 169 countries. So that's huge. So tell us, what's the podcast about and who's it designed for?
So, yeah, the podcast is called Career Relaunch, and it features everyday, ordinary people who have decided to step off the beaten path of a traditional career path and do something else. And sometimes they know exactly what they want to do next. Most of the times they don't. And so the types of people I tend to feature on the show are very much, I hope, aligned to the type of listener who listens to the show. And the type of listener who's listening to this show is probably somebody who is feeling like they might be on the wrong path, aren't exactly sure what they want to do instead, and haven't quite garnered that clarity or confidence or courage to take that next step. And so I try to feature people who have um, who are not only in that stage of the before and the after of their career change, but to try to catch people while they're in the middle of it. Because where they haven't figured everything out, where they actually aren't sure if they've done the right thing, because that is very much where most of my listeners are. So I think anytime you're thinking about doing a podcast, it's useful to think about what purpose is that podcast serving. And I think they generally fall into four categories. So it could be entertainment, could be information, inspiration, or companionship. And from the very start, I very much wanted my show to be about inspiration and companionship. Definitely not like an entertainment show, and probably less about providing advice to people. So just more like sharing other people's stories to normalize and give some comfort and give some companionship to other people who are trying to figure out, what do I do with my life? What do I do next? Especially when I feel like the costs are quite high for me to leave behind what I have been doing. So yeah, it's kind of the show in a nutshell.
Yeah. And look, I've got to say, you've absolutely ticked that inspiration box. And for me, I just find you've got so many different ordinary people, but with fascinating stories and from all different walks of life and seemingly from all across the globe. So how do you actually find your guests and or get inspiration for the people that you're going to have on the show?
So the vast majority of people who I've had on the show have been people I've reached out to proactively, either because I've seen them featured somewhere, or maybe I've seen them featured in a particular article, or maybe I've just heard about them through somebody else, or I've seen a LinkedIn post about them. So, for example, there was a guy I had on the show named Roman Havrish, who was well, he's Ukrainian, based in Ukraine, and was in Kiev when the war started. And I only heard about him because one of his colleagues had put a post up on LinkedIn about how he had to leave the country and was fleeing to a different country with his wife and daughters. And I just reached out to him because I thought he had an interesting story about trying to keep his agency afloat amid the war. Um, there are people who are also listeners who will just write in and just say, "Hey, I'm finding the show interesting. Here's my situation." And I actually like getting listeners on the show. So these aren't people who are like eager to share their story, but I found that they're sometimes the best people to get on the show. Occasionally I'll have people I have an application page on my website. Occasionally I'll get people who are coming through who are applying to be on the show, and I'll have on the show. I would say that 99% of the time I don't tend to accept those people. And it's only because the types of people who apply tend to be the people who are trying to like promote something. And so it's been a little bit of a manual process for me. I don't use really podcast matching services. I don't tend to feature as many people who kind of reach out to me unsolicited, but it does happen occasionally.
Yeah. Now, I've got to say that episode that you recently did with your guest from the Ukraine, I found it incredibly interesting. And what it really highlighted to me, and to go back to our conversations earlier, when you're choosing to accept change and make a change in your life. But what happens in situations like this, where change was just thrust upon you, like where you don't have a choice, and be it career, life, when something like that happens, and even, to a lesser extent, what happened to all of us through COVID, how do you find the silver linings in that type of change when it wasn't a choice?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There's definitely, I guess, two categories of career change. If you want to kind of put it simplistically, there's the change that you choose to make, and there's the changes that just kind of land on you, either through maybe you've been made redundant, or there's been an economic downturn, or your company goes through a reorganizational strategy, or in this case with Roman, there's literally a war breaking out in your country. So there's a spectrum. We have had people on the show who have gone through changes that have happened to them. I wouldn't say that they're the majority of the people on the show. Most of the people we have on the show have chosen to make a change. But for example, we had a woman on the show based in Detroit, Michigan, Anna Wagner, and she went through multiple rounds of layoffs at multiple companies while she was a new mother. And we do talk on the show a lot about how to deal with career setbacks, and all you can really do is to try your best to find a way forward and to try your best to figure things out, even though you may not know exactly where you want to go. So I found that the people out there who just take their best guess at what to do next, how to deal with their situation, end up getting further than the people who are trying to figure out the perfect step to take, the perfect resolution to their current situation. So yeah, it's kind of a guess and check sort of process, and to just put yourself out there, try to put one foot in front of the other, but it's not easy.
Yeah, it's that, like, that progress over perfection saying just really sort of resonates with me. And what I love of what you were saying about Roman is, like, you actually reached out to him as your way of helping in terms of someone who's in Ukraine, who's got a business, he's got a digital marketing business. And
That's right.
what's
Yeah.
what's the way that you could help him was to help spread message about his business and the work that he's doing, which I think is brilliant. So if you are looking for a digital marketer, jump onto Joseph's website and or podcast, and you'll be able to listen to the episode about Roman and his situation and what he's going through in Ukraine. And I think it was just a beautiful way to be able to help when you can't help from a necessarily from a physical perspective being there and things like that. So showing your support, it's really nice.
Definitely. Episode 82.
There you go. So, Joseph, as someone who is noticing that there's maybe a tension between maintaining the status quo and then moving on to something new, what advice or what questions should they be asking themselves?
Well, I suppose the first question you may want to ask yourself is doing, well, it kind of revolves around doing a bit of a current situation analysis. How happy am I? How energized do I currently feel? How much is my current work having an impact, either negative or positive, on the rest of my life? So I think that's one of the first things to understand is if you're kind of balancing status quo versus doing something brave, maybe taking a bold leap, is to think about what do you what do you maintain in your life by staying, and how important is that to you? So maybe it's money, oftentimes it is, or stability or status, or maybe the credibility you get from working for a well-known organization. So what do you maintain in your life by staying there, and how important is that to you? And then the second thing to think about is, okay, if I were to take a leap, what what would that bring to me? What might that open up for me? And how important is that for me? So maybe you, by staying, you do retain, let's say, I don't know, your salary, or stable income. But by leaving, you actually get to have more control of your time, or maybe you have flexibility, or maybe it allows you to control your schedule in a way where you can be home more nights of the week to tuck your kid in at night. And maybe at this particular moment in your life, that is what's most important to you. So everything is a trade off, and it's about figuring out what is most important to me at this specific moment in this specific chapter of my life. And that could change over time. And just realizing that not everything is forever can sometimes alleviate the pressure that you may feel to get everything exactly right across all aspects of your life and your career and your professional life all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that leap of faith, isn't it? And I think back of my own like personal life experiences and times that were really tough and had to make decisions. When you come out the other side, you look back and you go, "Oh my goodness, I'm so glad I made that decision or went down that road." So it's why you're in it, and there's a lot of uncertainty and ickiness. It's kind of just sitting with that and trying to work through it and knowing that what awaits you on the other side is going to be so much better. So,
Definitely. Yeah.
Joseph, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your insights with us today. And I really just hope that it's given motivation to one of our listeners who's maybe feeling that itch to that something better awaits them. So I really hope that this episode really gives them some insights into how to bravely let go of an aspect of their life and just to open the door up for other opportunities. So, how can people find out more about you, Joseph, continue the conversation, where do we find you?
Well, there's two places you can go. So if you want to learn more about me and my work, you can go to josephliu.co. And if you want to check out the podcast, if you want to hear some of these stories of people who've made major career changes, you can go to careerrelaunch.net.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure that we include all those links on the show notes too, Joseph.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. And I hope people found this useful today.
Excellent. No, thank you, Joseph. I'm really inspired. I really loved chatting with you, and I'm sure our listeners are going to too. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.